Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Heath Brown is an associate professor of public policy at John Jay College and at the CUNY Graduate Center. He's also a prolific author of scholarly articles and rarely popular websites, as well as books about politics and government. And he's my guest today. Hello.
Ronnie, thank you for having me.
You're
I
welcome.
love your show. I love CUNY TV. It's great to be here.
I think we have to talk about today's politics, but sort of in the context of the 4 books that you've written, because really it occurred to me that each of those books is relevant today.
Yeah, well, you hope when you write a book that if it doesn't sell well when it first comes out,
Right.
maybe later it will sell.
Right.
And so my
but
publishers...
it's the events that have happened that make it so much more relevant.
You try to write about things that are going to be meaningful now and in the future. And important political phenomena don't go away.
Yeah.
Even if they feel like they leave the news cycle, they're still with us. And so everything that I've written about are things that I care about deeply, and it's important when they continue to be meaningful. So thank you very much.
So the parties are so different now in this election. Why don't we go back to your book about the birthing or whatever, and how the Tea Party started and changed and what it meant?
Yeah, absolutely. And I could go back even further than that. I wrote a book about the presidential transition process.
Oh, yeah, well.
Not something that we need to focus on,
Right.
but what I took away from that is there was a time and place in Washington politics where the two parties disagreed, but around things like governance, around things like national security, about things that sort of deeply affected the security of the country, there was just wide agreement, and people would get together and put aside their differences. That is not a period that we live in right now. And there are consequences of that, some of the consequences that we could talk about. But the Tea Party was one way to think about that. The Tea Party, which started in 2009 and in some ways has left our conversation, but it has left a mark on our politics. The high level of polarization, the nature of the rhetoric, the tone of conversations has been forever impacted by the Tea Party and is still with us.
Well, didn't the Republican Party really become the Tea Party?
In some ways, the Tea Party was most effective at systematically running candidates against some of the most vulnerable Republican members of Congress. And those were often the most moderate members of Congress. And in some ways, one by one, they've managed to either defeat or get those moderate members of the Republican Party not to run again. And they have been replaced with members who may not call themselves members of the Tea Party, but they share a lot of the values and a lot of the beliefs of that original group.
And
so
they're
you're
still
right.
afraid of the election. They're still afraid of not satisfying their constituents.
Absolutely.
Because to get elected, they had to come from a certain kind of district, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That what's really changed is that awareness of what the electorate believes and the power of the most turbocharged members of the electorate. Some of them that live in the district and others that don't live in the district. And so that awareness that you can be primaried at any point based on transgressing on the most conservative views of public policy and politics is something that every Republican member of Congress cares about. It's why the recent impeachment hearings played out in the way that they did.
Well, most of the Republicans on the panel, on the committee, were basically Tea Party. One of them was the first Tea Party person, wasn't it?
Oh, you're absolutely right, that there still remain that original crop of Tea Party members. Now, some of them are not still there, but some of the most prominent, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, were some of the most vocal members of this Tea Party thing, and they remain prominent members of the Senate, and they were involved in the impeachment.
Did the Tea Party go after the state governments, or did the state representatives, or did that just evolve? Because they took control of a lot of the states and then started gerrymandering, right?
Absolutely. One of their legacies is what they were able to do in 2010 at the state level, and the gerrymandering that happened is still with us. Now, we're facing a new census and a new round of redistricting, but that's with us for 10 years. And so one of the things the Tea Party did, and for many people, the Tea Party were just a joke. They were just a punchline about fancy costumes and a rhetoric that nobody actually believed was real. Some of the harshest, most racist rhetoric that we have seen. But a lot of people just excused it. But the impact on states through redistricting, through effects on the conversation about what was going to be taken seriously, is something the Tea Party was incredibly sophisticated about. and incredibly effective about as well.
So did Trump is basically an old Tea Party person, isn't he? Has he enlarged the agenda of the Tea Party? And has he, he's become the Republican Party.
You know, he has become the Republican Party without a doubt. Whether he is the next generation of the Tea Party or affiliated with that early round of the Tea Party is a little harder to say. When he ran in 2016, there were two much more prominent Tea Party flag holders in Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz running. He defeated them, not by necessarily running as the more Tea Party candidate. One of the things the Tea Party claimed to care a lot about was reducing the federal budget, reducing deficits. Right. That was part of their important policy agenda. Now, you might say this was just all talk and they didn't really care about it, but they talked about it a lot. It's not something that Donald Trump has talked about, has not been a part of his administration. And for that reason, you have to think about him as something different.
And the national debt has gone sky high, so.
Continues to grow.
Right. Now, take that and the transition and the vetting of people to be members of the cabinet and how they filled agencies with jobs. And look at Trump.
Sure.
I mean, now, so what is the basic thing? Is it that the Republicans are so concerned about their own reelection? Is politics become a profession for some of these people?
You know, I don't know if it has become a profession any more than it was in the past. But the nature of the profession, I think, has changed greatly. And one of the ways it's changed is the impact of media on the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So the Fox News effect on members of Congress, both their use of Fox News to go on and promote their messages, that as a place where retired members of Congress go and pick up lucrative contracts, can't be ignored. I think that's a very, very important game changer in a way to the Republican Party. And there are analogies within the Democratic Party, but that effect of the Tea Party and Fox News that worked so seamlessly together has transformed what it means to be a conservative in Washington, what it means to be a member of the Republican Party, both while you're elected, but also, as importantly, once you leave Congress and take a seat at the Fox News reporting desk or go off and pursue a career in lobbying. And so that really is a big change.
In the old days, Channel 5 in New York was originally a Dumont-sponsored station. And it really changed when Murdoch bought it, right? Channel 5 was not a radical station at all.
Sure, based on everything I've read, my reading is the same. Right. I remember growing up, and this was not a political juggernaut. The impact of Rupert Murdoch, his vision for what he could do with established media outlets, well-known media outlets that were not well known for what he intended to do with them. The New York Post is another good example of a media outlet that had a long history that was not nearly what he imagined it to be.
It used to be the liberal paper when I was younger.
Things change.
Right. But Murdoch, I particularly remember when Murdoch wanted to buy Channel 5, he wasn't a citizen. And I remember because my husband went to his swearing in and Jimmy knew what the point was, that he wanted to get this station. So we're saying that two individuals, in a way, have really created a whole different world. I mean, the Congress now is not an equal partner. It's not watching over the executive branch. The president has really destroyed that whole relation and protection. And Murdoch is there feeding him.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, these individuals are very important. But it's also the institutions that matter a lot. If not Rupert Murdoch, there could have been somebody else who emerged. If not Donald Trump, there were others that could have filled that spot. So I think as a scholar, what I try to do is to balance the fascinating individual stories about some of these people with the other institutions and factors of politics that go beyond individuals that can be generalized from. And much of what I think interesting scholars do is to try to juggle that, to try to attribute things where they need to be attributed to.
Well, are you shocked by the difference of the separation of powers Are you shocked by the chief executive attacking the Supreme Court and attacking a court system and overriding the Congress with the House and stuff?
You know, you've been following politics as much as I have. This didn't just
Longer than you
happen.
have.
This just didn't happen in 2016.
Yeah.
The rising prominence of the White House, the rising prominence of the executive branch has been something that's been going on for decades.
When did it start, with Reagan?
Oh, I think that there are ways that we can attribute this to Ronald Reagan. I think there are ways that Congress has given up control to the executive branch that precede Ronald Reagan. I think the muscular executive branch and a Congress that's willing to give over power, much of its legislative power, is something that has a long history. What has changed in some ways is how incredibly obvious it is now that members of the Senate right now are working so closely with the administration in ways that maybe would have happened behind the scenes in the past. Now they're quite willing to express things that in the past you would have kept quite secret.
But we know that a lot of them disagree with the president.
I think we do know that. I think it's unreasonable to think that members of the House and Senate who have for a long time expressed views that are quite different than what the president expresses, the social conservatives that run throughout the Republican Party, surely haven't changed their mind on any number of
Debt
things.
is one of the questions. Yeah, right.
Debt is an issue as well.
Right.
But things change and people put their priorities to the side. And I think that's part of what we see in Washington now is priorities that seem to matter more than anything else in the past have been put aside for the expediency of a set of policies that people would never have supported in the past, at least wouldn't have put at the top of their agenda.
I think politicians also get corrupted by the environment. I mean, they like being senators. It's a club, right? And it brings all kinds of perks. Not as many as it used to because they don't have the add-ons, but don't you think it's like a club that they're all...
It is in a way, but at least the Washington that I've read about, that I've heard about, that people talk about, sure sounds like a more enjoyable place to be than it is now. Most members of Congress spend very little time there.
Yeah.
Most are going back to their districts as quickly as they possibly can, in part because there's enormous pressure to be constantly running for office. For a place that is clubby, they don't want to spend a whole lot of time in that club.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I think that club sort of manifests itself in some different ways. I think that what has changed in Washington can be attributed to a lot of things, but that sense that people kind of see eye to eye and respect and trust people who they may disagree
You're right.
with.
I think they can't be happy about it. I really do.
I don't think this is a job that many of them enjoy.
So another book was about money in politics. And this is certainly a year to look at that. Aren't there two different things? I mean, it's not unusual that a wealthy person is running, right? And before campaign finance, they could invest their money, I guess.
Sure, absolutely. You know, since the publication of the book, there have been a number of not just wealthy, but incredibly wealthy individuals run for the presidency. And we now have a number of them now that have in some ways traded on their success in the world of business to a type of success in the world of politics. It's not a new story, but the extent of it, I think, is something that we haven't seen before. We've never seen a candidate spend as much of their personal money as Michael Bloomberg has been over the last couple of months.
And Steyer?
Steyer as well. And so we just haven't seen that scale. It's one of the reasons why the conclusions of the book, which were that money matters a lot in politics, but not always in the way that you think. Money has never, except for in those cases of outright fraud, really bought elections. It's part because often two candidates running in a close race spend about the same amount of money. And when the race is not close, the spending is often quite different. But it's not because of the money, it's because the races are uncompetitive. But we've never really seen a case like Michael Bloomberg or Tom Steyer. This is new territory and something that is very hard to understand based on the past practices. There's no doubt that money is playing a part in politics right now in a way that it never has in the past. Understanding exactly how it's playing a role is something I think we're just starting to get our hands around.
Oh, there's so much because, it's so obvious that people have bought. I mean, presidents have always appointed people who were supporters, I guess, usually. Not always, but it's so obvious now what a $1 million contribution will get you. And then also the president is making money while he's president, so it's all different. But what about the small contributions? Is that becoming a major change?
It sure seems like in Bernie Sanders' case.
Yeah.
I think what I think is we see from the Sanders campaign is both what those small contributions mean monetarily for what he could do, but also what they've allowed him to do in terms of building an infrastructure that has grown and grown and grown strong. And so whether you like or don't like the ideas of Bernie Sanders, he has been incredibly effective at building a political movement around his campaign, and a movement that I think a lot of people thought after 2016 was just going to go away, or it was going to migrate to some other candidate. His ability to keep those supporters and the thousands and thousands of small donation individuals supportive of him is really remarkable. I think it says a lot about his political abilities that sometimes people dismiss because his legislative accomplishments haven't been nearly as remarkable as other members of the Senate, but it's this political infrastructure that he's built that I think is pretty incredible.
And it's so interesting because it's so against people with money.
I think it's very different. I mean, members of Congress, anyone running for office, the thing they enjoy least is fundraising. And you talk to almost anyone, you say, well, you must be running for office at some point, and they say, I would, except I don't like to ask people for money. And so any candidate that doesn't have to ask people for money and still can run is one that is going to have enjoy the process more than those that have to ask for money all the time. You've run for office, you know what this is like. People abhor the act of getting on the phone and asking for money. But these days, because it's so expensive to run, you have to do it.
Are you going to write a book about that? I mean, look at the use of media. That was a major difference, wasn't it? Buying time and buying commercials.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, on the one hand, access to media has become quite inexpensive and become democratized in a certain way. And any candidate can create a website. Any candidate can create a Twitter account. It seems like things have become quite not dependent on money. Yet at the same time, look at what the Trump campaign is focusing most of its efforts on, which is its digital media strategy. If media has become so inexpensive for campaigns, how come they're spending so much money on it? It's in part because media remains expensive, even if it looks like it doesn't cost anything to create a Facebook account for your campaign. The real money is the money that we don't see, is the advertising, digital or otherwise, that still is a big part of the game. It's just a little bit more hidden. And I don't think we've, to this day, quite understood what digital campaign advertising means. We understand what it means to see an ad on TV. We don't really understand why we're looking at that ad that we see when we open up whatever program we use. How come I'm seeing it and you're not seeing it? Or how come the version that I'm seeing looks a little different than the version you're seeing? That precision is what's incredibly expensive right now. And if you're a candidate that doesn't have the money to spend on that, you're going to be on a great disadvantage in the digital media environment.
But Bloomberg is also saturating the television with his commercials. I mean, I go back in politics before TV, and that was the structure of the party, right? I was the captain of a district. I was the television. I brought the message to the voter, and that made such a tremendous change.
Sure, absolutely. It's changed a lot. But at the same time, I think you can't discount the day-by-day grassroots work of the organizations, both the political organizations and the non-political organizations that are not symbolically going door-to-door knocking. They're actually going door-to-door knocking.
The field operation. I have a granddaughter. I was helping her, actually. I was making calls for her list. She was in Iowa.
Right. And this happens. This remains, and this is important. And it's important for all sorts of things, both for politics and campaigns, but for other things like just the census. I mean, that's done face-to-face based on convincing somebody that completing the census is actually important for their representation. We can think about politics becoming dominated by these virtual technologies, but a lot of it still is face-to-face, trying to convince someone to see the world a little differently than they currently see it. Your granddaughter's experience, I think, is indicative.
I spoke to a voter in Iowa in her district, and somehow the conversation became that I'm her grandmother and calling. And anyway, they were very impressed with that. And then one day she called me and she said, I knocked on the door and I started to talk, and they said, are you the granddaughter? It was very funny. Anyway.
No, I think you're exactly right. And every single person who's ever been involved in any campaign can tell a story exactly like that because it works.
Right.
Problem is, it's hard to do at a grand scale.
Exactly.
How do you get people to do it well, not just in a small neighborhood, over a block, but in a big neighborhood?
And that's Bernie's advantage, that he's done that.
He's done that.
And let's go to another thing, which is immigrant groups. Because certainly that's been an aim now with nonprofits that are helping immigrant populations to register and then to vote, right?
Absolutely. Registration is incredibly important. The groups that I have talked to in the past, and who I imagine if I talked to them today would say they care a lot about getting everyone registered. But right now, they also care about getting everyone counted. And so what I think you'll see over the next year or so is a shift in focus for many of these organizations, many of them operating on tiny budgets with primarily volunteer staff. And I think a lot of them, whatever happens in the election in November, are going to say, what we're doing is building beyond that, and what we need most important as anything is to make sure our community is well counted, because if they're well counted, then they're going to have the impact and representation that they should. But getting people who are new to the country to understand the importance of completing the census, to not feel like this is something that they're going to use to victimize them, is becoming incredibly difficult. And the Trump administration is in part to blame for that. I think they have turned the census into something that people are worried about more than any time in the past, rather than turning something that people should feel like is a part of their rights and duties as a citizen. That's a big change, and I think the Trump administration is very aware of what they're doing when they have politicized the census.
It's so interesting, right? Oh, definitely. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the fear of the immigration stuff and all that, it's definitely true. And now it's so interesting, though, because so much discussion is about the Latino thing. But once, how do they get counted, a person? Is it Latino, and then is it, what's the other term? Latino and...
Hispanic?
Hispanic, right.
So
Latino is South America and those countries?
Yeah, the census has grown in its sophistication over how people are counted. And today, unlike in the past, the census provides lots of options for people to better reflect their identity, and the better chance we have for our data to reflect the actual identities of people living just across New York City, the better we can do in providing services, not generically to people, but very specifically. Things like what languages voter information should be provided on the day of the election is reflected in part by what data the census collects. And if you have a finer grained analysis of what languages are spoken in a neighborhood, then you're going to have a better chance that a person who speaks that language will be in the polling station to provide the help that some people need. If you don't have that information in a sophisticated way, then somebody who speaks a language, who doesn't feel comfortable speaking English, is going to show up and probably go back home and be a non-voter for reasons that are bureaucratic more than anything else. That's why the census matters a lot. That's why the census matters a lot to future voting. So it's registering to vote, turning out to vote, but also participating in all of these other things.
How you target your audience and find out what you're doing. The other party, we didn't have time to talk about the Democratic Party. That's undergoing great change now, too.
Absolutely. This is a party that is becoming much more varied than it was ever in the past. But as it's become varied, you have a set of issues that brings people together and another set of issues that brings people apart. And so I think what the Democrats are doing right now is trying to figure out how to weave together a group of people who share some set of interests, but another set that is going to drive them apart. And the candidate that's going to come out and likely be successful is the one that can do that. It's very, very hard to do, to get people to agree on a wide range of most very important
There
issues.
used to be agendas that and from conventions that they really paid attention, platforms that really were paid attention. Do you think that that means that we're going to have a new party emerge?
I don't think so. I think the rules that we have in this country make two parties what we're going to see for a long time.
So we've come to the end, but you have to promise me you'll come back before the election, because some of these points we can go back to.
I'll come
Talk
back
more.
as many times as you invite me.
Thank you very much.